Halfland, an ahistorical prehistory. The Battle of Rosebay Rise. In the year 99 of the Common Reckoning, as summer faded into autumn, Godric, the king of the Skeldings, marched his army north towards Overwater, seeking to locate and destroy the forces of the rebel Grimbold and his dwarvish allies. He encountered them at Rosebay Rise. Rosebay Rise was an unremarkable ridge of no great height. Its western end was crowned with a small wood. To the south of the wood, at the foot of the ridge, sat Rosebay Farm. The path Godric took ran northwards to the east of this farm, up to the foot of Rosebay Rise. It then turned westward, passing between Rosebay Rise and a small forested hill, before resuming its northwards course at the point where the eastern extremity of Rosebay Rise subsided into the plain. After passing Rosebay Rise, the path ran through an area of dense woodland. The core of Godric's army was the king's spearmen, 150 armoured warriors, bearing spears and shields, and led by Godric in person. Godric also had 150 or so armoured cavalry, led by Aldric, the captain who Godric intended to appoint in Grimbold's place as warden of Overwater. Aldric and the captains around him were armed with lances, but the majority of the horsemen were not so high born, and carried javelins to allow them to strike at a distance, along with swords for close-up use. Finally, Godric also had some 250 light infantry, variously equipped with bows and javelins. As Godric approached Rosebay Rise, he could see Grimbold's forces arrayed along the crest of the ridge. Grimbold stationed himself in the centre, amidst the ranks of his spearmen, who numbered more than 200. Some of these were battle-hardened veterans clad in mail, while others were unarmoured levies who had never previously held a spear or a shield. Orm was stationed on Grimbold's left, with 150 armoured dwarves. The front ranks of dwarves were armed with crossbows, with spear dwarves behind them. Grimbold also had some light infantry. He concealed his 100 or so archers on his right flank, in the woods above Rosebay Farm, and 100 javelineers on his left, in the valley at the foot of the eastern slopes of Rosebay Rise. Godric was cautious. On his left flank he pushed forward half of his skirmishers to secure Rosebay Farm. The other half advanced in the centre, screening the king's spearmen who followed behind them. His cavalry he held in reserve. Atop the hill, Grimbold and Orm held position, waiting for the enemy to come to them. But Grimbold did wave his javelineers forward. They advanced up the hill in front of them, and into the woods on its summit. On Grimbold's right, his archers were not so circumspect. Seeing Godric's skirmishers advancing up to the fields of Rosebay Farm, they emerged from the woods and streamed down the hill, taking cover behind the field wall, from where they could pour arrows into Godric's men. But their plan did not come to fruition. Even as Grimbold's archers reached for their quivers, Aldric led his horsemen in a headlong charge into and over the field, crashing into the hapless bowmen, massacring them before a single arrow could be nocked and loosed. The few survivors ran back up the hill and into the woods from whence they had come. In the centre, Godric continued to advance. In the van, the skirmishers started to divert to the right, with the intention of harassing the ranks of dwarves arrayed on that flank. Behind them, the king's spearmen continued to push directly forward, seeking to come to grips with the spearmen of Grimbold. And now it was Grimbold's turn to make an unexpected attack. As Godric's skirmishers advanced further toward Orm's dwarves, Grimbold's javelineers emerged from the wooded heights where they were concealed, announcing their presence with a rain of javelins, an iron-bladed rain that proved deadly to some of Godric's skirmishers. But Godric's light infantry were made of stern stuff, not to be deterred from their purpose by a few paltry javelins. Leaving a small group of archers behind them to loose arrows at Grimbold's spearmen, the remainder of Godric's skirmishers continued their advance toward Orm and his dwarves. The dwarves responded with a volley of crossbow bolts, and then the spear dwarves advanced through the ranks of crossbow dwarves before them, facing their advancing foes with a hedge of glittering spear points. This caused Godric's skirmishers to hesitate in their advance, and as they did so, Grimbold's javelineers came charging down the hill behind them, threatening their rear. Meanwhile, on Godric's left, his cavalry thundered up the slope before them and turned right, skirting the edge of the trees and galloping eastward along the ridge toward Grimbold and his spearmen. Grimbold reacted by ordering the rear ranks of his spearmen to move to their right, creating a line of spearmen facing the onrushing cavalry and protecting his right flank. This did not deter the horsemen from their charge. As they neared Grimbold's spearmen, they hurled their javelins and then, drawing their swords, crashed into their opponents. But the thin line of spearmen held steady. Many horsemen fell, and the remainder reeled back in disarray. Grimbold's spearmen gave out a great roar, and then another, as on their left Grimbold's javelineers rushed headlong into Godric's hesitant skirmishers. An inconclusive melee ensued. Above them, on Rosebay Rise, Orm ordered his spear dwarves once more to take up position behind the crossbow dwarves, so that the latter could have a clear shot at any targets that might present themselves. But it was not the dwarvish crossbows that successfully found a target. Instead, the archers who had previously detached from Godric's skirmishers loosed several flights of arrows at the unshielded crossbow dwarves, causing several casualties. In front of the dwarves, the combat between the light infantry petered out, as Godric's skirmishers withdrew to regather themselves. But this was just a sideshow. In the centre, the two shield walls of spearmen advanced into each other. The real fighting had begun, and a hard fight it was. But the king's spearmen were having the better of it. Grimbold saw his spearmen falling in front of him, and called the spearmen he had previously stationed on his right flank to his aid. These reinforcements crashed into the king's spearmen, slaying many of them. One group of Grimbold's spearmen cut their way through to Godric and his entourage. For a moment it seemed that Godric would be slain and Grimbold would win the day. But it was not to be. For along the ridge to Grimbold's right, Aldric had rallied his horsemen. Once more they swept along the ridge toward Grimbold. But now there were no serried ranks of spearmen to hold them at bay. Instead, the horsemen charged directly into Grimbold and his bodyguards. The horsemen had the advantages of surprise, momentum, and numbers. Most of the men around Grimbold perished, and Grimbold himself took a blow to the head, which knocked him near senseless. Disorientated, he staggered out of the fray. Luckily for Grimbold, a group of his spearmen had observed the devastating effects of Aldric's cavalry charge, and had decided that, if Godric wanted Rosebay Rise so much, he should have it, and that they should vacate the vicinity. As they started to pull away from the melee, Grimbold reeled into their midst. They surrounded him and carried him away from the fight, thus justifying their precipitate withdrawal. By now, the combat atop the ridge had become a sprawling, confused brawl, as troops from all over the battlefield headed toward the action and joined the contest. This included Orm, who, at the time of Aldric's charge, was leading his spear dwarves up to support Grimbold. Seeing Grimbold carried past him, Orm calculated that he needed to delay the cavalry long enough for Grimbold to get clear, and to allow the rest of the army to make an orderly retreat, in the hope that it could fight another day, rather than being cut to pieces in a disorderly rout. And so Orm and his spear dwarves charged into Aldric's cavalry. Several horsemen were spitted on dwarvish spears, and the remainder fell back. And thus began Orm's famed fighting retreat, which won him so much renown, and of which the dwarvish skalds never after tired of singing. While Orm gathered the remnants of Grimbold's army to him, the dwarves held Godric's men at bay. Again and again Godric's troops threw themselves at the dwarves, and again dwarvish spear points and crossbow bolts drove them back. And each time the dwarves would retreat further along the ridge and reform their ranks, awaiting the next assault. And as Grimbold's men rallied to Orm's banner, they too took their place in the ranks, and Orm's dwarves and Grimbold's men fought alongside each other. But it was the dwarves who fought hardest, and many dwarves died that day. Eventually Orm's retreat brought him to the eastern end of the ridge. Behind him the land sloped down into the forest. Once more Godric threw his troops forward, and once more Orm's ranks threw them back. And then, as Godric regrouped his men for yet another effort, Orm and his dwarves, and those of Grimbold's men who had stood with them, withdrew down the slope, and made their escape among the trees. Thus ended the Battle of Rosebay Rise.